So today, we continue to try to explore these things through Chinese eyes as well as American, to try to get a perspective on that. So that's where we were. And right now, we're going to look at demographics, and we're going to be looking at millennials. So our first speaker is Professor Yong, who comes to us from North Carolina, the University of North Carolina. And he has done an incredible array of research, including research into the challenge of aging, what's happening in terms of young people, and all kinds of demographic things. And so I think you're going to get a lot out of this. One of the things that I want you to focus on is both the establishment of the one-child policy, so-called one-child policy, it was never quite that, but also the disestablishment. He's got some real insights onto the policy, its impact long-term, and to what drove the Chinese government to change that policy. Friends, let's welcome Professor Tsai.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Dube, and thanks to the 1990 Institute for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here. Professor Dube has already set the bar very, very high. I hope I can meet the expectation. What I'm going to talk about today is China's demography and China's changing demography. Everything is changing so fast in China, including its population. As a demographer, you probably heard about China. Let me see if I can. Which direction should I? Okay, you must have heard about this. China is the most populous country. China has a lot of people. Its population right now is roughly 1.4 billion. Its growth has slowed down significantly, and it actually will lose its title of #1 population, most populous country to India in roughly less than 10 years. Okay, and then after that, China will turn into negative growth territory. It's just like Japan. China is following Japan's step quite closely. So this is, what you will see when you go to China. A couple of pictures you already have seen the Great Wall. People love Great Wall and get on the wall. And there's a Chinese thing called the people mountain, people sea. The mountain full of people, a sea full of people. That's that. Okay, and so the question is, what people brings us? A lot of people certainly is a symbol of prosperity. Market requires people, and when you have lots of people, that's a symbol of the strength. At the same time, our population could be regarded as a burden, and for a long, long time, at least for the last 60 years, China has been thinking about population as a burden. So what I'm going to do in today's talk is I'm going to talk about China's demographic changes, and with the focus on one-child policy, use the one-child policy to bridge China's current situation and China's future situation, and talk about the policy implications. So let's start with a simple demographic tool called the population pyramid. Basically, we do a survey, we ask everyone's age and sex. Those are the demographers care about the most. And we can stack up together, this called a population pyramid. The ideal pyramid is basically population should look like the age structure should look like a pyramid. The foundation should be wide, and then in the demographic process, people die off in the end. When you get to the top, very few people, lucky people, will reach 100. So, but if we look at China's population structure, this is from 2010 census. It does not resemble a pyramid. It looks like a pagoda or something like that. Okay, and it tells actually quite a bit about the history of China over the last roughly 100 years. So China's population is very interesting. It's, generally the biological process take care of us quite well. At the birth, we have roughly 105 boys, 200 women. And because males do all kinds of crazy things, jump off roof, driving motorcycle, so males tend to die off faster than female, and gradually we reach a balance roughly around 40 years old, and after that, female outlive men quite a bit. So overall, for most of the population, the sex should be balanced, but China is not. Okay, and the historical part was infanticide. The modern version is sex-selective abortion. So China, in Chinese population, only the very old part of the population has more females. Oh, sorry, I think that's a typo. There's a more. Except the old, I was right. Sorry, my eyesight is not very good. And then we can say the baby boom coming out a little bit after, what the baby boom, here after World War II, we have baby boom. China, what happened was after the end of the victory of revolution, the establishment of People's Republic of China. And right after that, there was the famine, 1961 to 1959 to 1961. There were roughly 30 million people killed in that famine. And then there was a recovery. And after the recovery, China started called later, longer, fewer policy. This is a birth control policy. It basically pushes people to marry at a later time, have a longer birth interval, and have fewer births. So that was the slogan in 1971 introduced. Interestingly, I did not highlight that. As you see a little bit of cultural revolution right there. It's 1966. So, population does tell us history. And then, you see fertility coming down rather dramatically in the 1970s. Before the one-child policy was introduced in 1981. You see a little bit dip, but that was not the policy itself. Then you see a huge rebound, and the rebound was an echo of the early baby boom after the famine. And then we see the fertility coming down. So, just by displaying this population age structure tells us the history of China over the last 60 to 80 years. So here, as a demographer, what I do is quite boring. I play with numbers. I can do simple projection. I can project the population into 2050 and with quite a good confidence where it's going. Okay, the reason is that you say the population age structure by 2050, it will resemble like this sandwich generation. You have one child at the bottom, a couple in the middle, and 4 elderly. So that's the population scenario we'll be looking at in roughly 30 years. The reason I can speak with confidence this will be the population age structure of China is because we know that this part, those age 40 and above in 2010, they are already born and they are dying at a expected speed. We know we all want to live longer, and we have a way to project how long people will live. Roughly every decade, we actually gain roughly 1.5 to 2 years in life expectancy. That has been happening in China and happening across the world, although US is a little bit exceptional. We are on the slower side. Okay, and what's uncertain is on the low end. Okay, how can we be sure about this low fertility? We can probably from this graph, we can say, hey, this guy is making assumption that fertility is going to be low if not continue to decline. Okay, how can we be sure about that? So to convince you to provide support for this argument, I'm going to go back in the history to talk about one-child policy, talk about China's fertility decline. Okay, so this is basically a flip side of the population age structure. We already have seen the population age structure. This is measured in terms of number of births per woman. Okay, so before the revolution, right around the People's Republic of China, the fertility was roughly 6 babies per woman. Okay, and that's quite common in the East Asian demographic region. In the West European countries, tend to be 8. And in East Asian demographic region, tend to be around 6 because space is a little bit longer because of breastfeeding. Okay, then you say the famine had a huge effect on the fertility. There were roughly estimated 20 to 30 million babies got delayed. The delay means right after the famine there was a rebound. And the rebound did not stay for too long. In the 1960s, fertility stayed roughly still at 6. Then in 1971, China introduced the later, longer, fewer policy. This is not the one-child policy. And you see the dramatic fertility decline in less than 1 decade, from roughly 6 to 2.7 in 8 years. That's actually never happened in history in any other countries in this large scale. Then for an interesting reason, China introduced the one-child policy. And you saw the fertility was already dropping. Why are you introducing one-child policy? And the one-child policy, you see a little bit of dent in fertility. Then the fertility in the 1980s basically, swinged around 2.5. Did not change that much until 1990. China introduced, more administration rule basically to tighten up the control of one-child policy. So the question is, why the one-child policy did not work, or what made it did not work. The other thing to put into context, you say, I just, here is China comparing its the neighboring regions, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, and South Korea. You see fertility is coming down all across East Asia. China is not exceptional. Yes, China has had the one-child policy, but China was not exceptional in terms of fertility decline. And China is also not exceptional. It's actually very similar in terms of fertility right now in comparison with its neighbors. And the other thing is, this is also a global phenomenon. We can line up data from all across the world, and basically from 1975 and to 2005. The remarkable thing is, although the data are 30 years apart, the relationship remain linear. Oh, sorry. Where something is? Oh, yeah. Remain linear, roughly linear. Basically, the GDP per capita increase, it's in the larger scale, the fertility will come down. And so that's, what Indians have been arguing, development is best contraceptive. Okay, China was indeed exceptional in 1975, that in terms of economic development and fertility, but by 2005, it's no longer an outlier. Although a footnote here is China, we should not treat China as an outlier, because interestingly, the Communist Party did a lot of things, including increased women employment and increased women's education. If we put those things, China actually was not an outlier even in 1975. And if we compare other more populous countries like India and Indonesia, again, fertility decline is a global trend. So to put together that, what I try to say here is the fertility was already declining, fertility was already low, and so the question is why China introduced the one-child policy. Okay, so one-child policy was, the decision was made in very short period of time. In roughly 1 year, the central leadership made the decision to push for the one-child policy. The thinking behind it was very linear. Okay, it's the idea, say, hey, we want to develop our economy and population becomes a burden. The goal at the time Deng Xiaoping put out was to quadruple GDP in 20 years. And by some rocket scientist calculation, I call them rocket scientists because they were indeed work for the defense industry in China. They had access to computer. Nowadays, my computer is very powerful. I can do all kinds of population projection at the time. Only they have that access. And they did the projection. According to their projection, the only way for China to reach this mighty goal of quadruple GDP in 20 years was to control its population within 1.2 billion. And the only way to control the population within 1.2 billion was to implement a one-child policy. So that was the rationale. And the thinking was this, everyone recognized this is a draconian policy. And it's not going to be popular. But the decision was made at the very top leadership to say, hey, this is our collective temporary sacrifice for the sake of the country and for our people. And because if we don't do this, we are going to have lots of babies. And you probably heard about Chinese people prefer son, and Chinese would like to have large family. China was still larger than the agricultural economy, all those things there. So in a way, if you think about a public policy perspective, it was almost a perfect policy. You say it's very articulate, motivation and very clear goal. Say, hey, we want to reach this, and we are all in this together. From top leadership to the bottom society, we are all going to live through this. So if you look at the current leadership, the 7 top guys, on average, they have 1 child per person. Okay, one of them have 2, and because he got married before the one-child policy, and one of them did not have any child. It does not have any child. So on average, it's 1 child. So it's a perfect policy. It's and it also have a huge commitment from the government. Government established a special departmental level agency to take charge of this, and there was quite a bit of international support in China in 1980 when China opened up UN's first mission. The world was all worried about China's population would go crazy, the population bomb. You probably have heard of it. So UN, helped China to do a population census in 1982. China was actually for the first time got access to modern technology to do the census. Okay, so all those things were there, but it did not work. Okay, the implementation was, the idea was that 1 child per couple, but in the end, there was, you see, lots of struggle in the urban area and especially in the rural area. So in the end, China had to reach some kind of compromise. Basically, the rural part, most of the rural Chinese population will live under so-called 1.5 child policy. 1.5 is from, if the first child is a girl, you can have a second one. Okay, so that's the 1.5 child. Okay, so the question is, did it work? Okay, so government says it worked magnificently. It reduced Chinese population by 400 million, and it's a major factor behind China's economic growth. And it's also, by 2009, China put out the argument, this is our contribution to global warming. To combat the global warming, we already controlled our population. So the English newspaper said, this is really inconvenient truth. We need to adopt a Chinese model. Everyone should limit our population size. And the Economist, to our dismay, that by 2014, still claimed that China's one-child policy was number 4 in terms of the contribution to the battle against global warming. So the number is actually totally wrong. You have seen it in my slides that the fertility decline happened before the one-child policy. The major part in China's fertility was roughly 6 children per woman, and by 1978 it was already at 2.7. Okay, and right now it's roughly 1.5-ish. So the major part of fertility happened before the one-child policy. That's a simple fact. Second, remember this 1.2 billion. The reason China needed to implement the one-child policy was to control population within 1.2 billion. But by 2000, China's population was at 1.27 billion. So that's roughly 70 million more than its control goal. But China's economy fried, and it's more than quadrupled in 20 years. So that means the logic was not there to start with. And clearly, the science focused on the wrong indicator, because we know the fertility, the TFR, could be a very misleading measure. The reason, for example, in this country, we had a baby boom was not only because women having lots of babies, in their lifetime. It's also because lots of GIs returned from the service and they got married at the same time, having kids at the same time. Suddenly, we got a baby boom. So partly was that was the reason. And the underlying argument is, that the argument would also go that if China were to lift the policy, actually already lifted, that fertility would rebound rather dramatically. Okay, and as the last sentence just there, this one-child policy is a brutal violation. So the end of one-child policy comes into 3 steps, and this is after roughly 20 years of a push. I'm proud of being part of this group pushing for Chinese government to change the policy. And in March 2017, China announced the merger of the political bureaucratic foundation to change the policy. And in November of 2017, that announced the so-called single side, one side of one-child couple to have a second child. And in October of 2015, that would China now allow so basically a two-child policy. Okay, so you can see, yes, I'm proud of this process, pushing for a government policy change, but it's a top-down process. It's not, it's not a demographic process. It's a leadership-made decision, and the motivation was interesting. The argument made in the decision was in large part is China is in our so-called the new norm. New norm is a new economic norm. Is we are going to get into the modest growth period, and to stimulate further growth, we need more people. So the idea is again very much a utilitarian. The third one is I want to say is it's one size fits all. It's still two children, for everyone. It won't allow you to go for third child, and still for unmarried, fertility is still highly, directly tied to marriage, and we will see how. So there is a very interesting and unmistakable parallel between the establishment, the implementation of the one-child policy and the abandoning of the one-child policy. Remember, in late 1970s, Deng Xiaoping came into power. He needed to establish his legitimacy, and he had the power to do that. Now, the Xi Jinping came into power in 2012, and he has a new set of agenda to go for it. And the economic reality was very different. In late 1970s was about not enough resource. Now the economic reality is economic slowdown. So it's about the economic purpose again. And for the sake of time, I'm going to not go through all the details. Basically, in short term, that we see small changes in 1980. Okay, and we also see a small change for the implementation of the two-child policy. And the question is, what's the longer term? Okay, we know the longer term effect of the one-child policy is relatively limited in terms of demographic effect, but it has a social sidal effect. For the two-child policy, I'm going to put my words here. In 3 years, you will not see any major effect at all. Yes, right now we're still going through this period. There's a reservoir of people who wanted to have a second child, and they are having a second child in this year, next year, maybe a little after that. Okay, so I hope I have convinced you that this part is indeed coming down. So the reality is clear to see, and this is UN's projection. Everyone, all the demographers are doing more or less the same projection. We will say that China's population will reach its peak, and in the next roughly 15 years, but its aging process is going to continue, and the peak aging will come around 2060-ish. And by the time that China's population will roughly over 50%. The median age will be around 50 years old, and that's a country. Will be a very different country. And China's aging very, very fast. This is the process. Going age 65, going from 9% to 25%. China only takes just basically one generation to get there. And here's how quickly it's changing. This is a picture taken in 2008, that the pink building was a primary school. It's a donation made by people in Shanghai to Jiangsu, in a county in Jiangsu province. They made the building in pink because it's a school. Okay, and by the time, in roughly 12 years later, it was converted to a retirement home. That's how fast the change in China is happening. And so one thing, aging is setting in, and there's no way to reverse that, because those people who will get old, they're already born, and we don't expect more kids to come in. And one thing, the other demographic change, thank you. The other main demographic change is China is urbanizing rather fast, roughly 1% per year. Okay, and here's a different perspective to look at. I just put the age effect of age urbanization in the context. And you say, yes, there's a vertical increase basically from 2000 to 2010 census. There's a large increase in urbanization. And interestingly, the lowest urbanization rate has been in this group, the children. Okay, why they are not urbanized? They've been left behind. They've been asked to stay with their grandparents, and while their parents, just one side, working in the urban area, working in those factories, Foxconn factories, and so on and so forth. So that is clearly, an institutional setup that's a barrier in China to, in a way, to have a higher fertility. Because if you would let parents and kids together and let kids to stay in school in the urban area, probably there'll be a higher fertility. Okay, there's another main negative thing after the one-child policy was the rise of sex ratio at birth. I already have said that sex ratio is, whether you believe in God or not, it's roughly 105 to 100 boys per 100 girls that at birth. And in China, because of sex-selective abortion, it started in right around 1980, that it skyrocketed, and it reached at a point over 120 boys per 100 girls. And that's at the national average. If you go to the mountainous area in China, and the rate could be as high as 150, in certain area 200 boys per 100 girls. Okay, and that creates enormous pressure on society. And let me show you a picture. So this is a picture, a recent article published in China Quarterly saying that China's missing girls are hitting the population. I wrote a rebuttal, and it will come out in about a month or so. Basically, this phenomenon is real. So there are roughly 30 million more Chinese boys than Chinese girls, roughly. Okay, accumulated over the last 30-some years, almost 40 years, this phenomenon has been going. So yes, the marriage market is very much unbalanced, and yes, numerically speaking, there is no such reservoir of women available if we want to get everyone married. And yes, there are brides imported from Vietnam and other countries, but China has such gigantic population. It's not going to happen. But this story is, I think, in a way biased towards men. Say hey, every man should get married. But what's going on in China right now is women are more and more women. Because of education, because of improvement of their status, they are delaying their marriage, and more and more so are not getting to married. Okay, so if you follow Chinese news, there are two very derogatory terms. One is called bare branches. They are on the male side, and on female side, it's called the leftover woman. Now, I really don't like it, because I think it's it's the progress. Women finally can choose whether they get married or not. They don't want to settle. They don't want to compromise into a not so great marriage. So with that, we can clearly see that fertility is not going to rescue China from a fertility decline is not going to happen easily. But I think I want to end the story on the positive side. Women in China, for good or for bad, the Communist Party pushed, part of the communism, the idea of communism come from Europe. And one key idea is gender equality. China's Communist Party has been pushing for gender equality, women's labor force participation, women's education rate is, quite high in China, and in many ways it's among, the highest in terms of labor force participation. And the Chinese women have lots of opportunities. And so, here's an example that there are so many self-made billionaires, self-made women billionaires, and 21 is in China. Okay, and so the focus, I think the society, if China had to adjust, it has to adjust how it treats women, and how women's status will change in the next a couple of decades also. Okay, so here's women's labor force participation, and interesting, we already say some social adjustment ongoing. That I have friends in China. It used to be the case that women would stay in Korea, and now they are compromised. Basically, for the sake of raising a family, they are compromised. It could be read as both as good as bad, but I think the focus should be on the women's side. Okay, so what goes from here to conclude my talk? That I already said the basic side, the basic demographic force is cold, and it's not going to change easily. Fertility is going to low, and it's already very low. In Shanghai, even with the now allow two-child policy, fertility is still roughly around 1. Okay, and this is not a unique Chinese phenomenon. I see quite a few Chinese Americans here. Chinese American fertility is roughly 1.5. Chinese Malays, is roughly 1.4. Fertility in Taiwan is barely 1. Okay, so this is there's a cultural phenomenon ongoing, and so fertility is not going to be changed easily. And mortality is going to continue to decline because everyone wants to live longer. China now has resource, and Chinese hospitals and the healthcare industry is catching up rather dramatically. We can foresee the continued growth in life expectancy. And yes, migration is happening rapidly. That will buy China some time, because remember this 1.5 child policy. The rural area have a higher fertility, and when they move into urban areas. So the interesting thing is, for example, in Shanghai's support ratio, basically number of workers per number of elderly, has been increasing over the last 10, 15 years because there are lots of migrants to go in. And with this kind of migration, that will buy China some time. But overall, the demographic momentum is setting in place. The aging is going to happen, and at a rapid scale. So in a way, we can, a lot of demographers like to talk about demographic dividend. Basically, by lowering the fertility, you buy the time to develop its economy. But China has reached the peak, has already passed the peak labor, and the demographic dividend has become more and more a demographic burden. Basically, the population is getting old. Okay, so the question is what we are going, how China will get out of this. First, I did not put it here. China is not alone. Japan is already in this territory. US is moving there, although a little bit slower. And all the developed part of the world are moving in the same direction. So we are all in this, process of figuring out. We survived the population bomb, and now we are going to survive the population aging. The second, China have all kinds of tools still in its toolbox through reform that might be help at least elevate this process. First, the urbanization. If you let the people, urbanization is urban is not only a change of lifestyle, it's also a change of productivity. And by reforming the hukou system, China has the potential to let more people work more efficiently. And Professor Dube already introduced that China has, invested quite a bit in the education system. Yes, China's education is, China is now mint out roughly 8 million college graduates every year. And interestingly, there are more female graduates than male graduates. And so through this process, through investment in human capital, we hope that China will have time to adapt to this reality. The last thing is the social welfare reform. Starting in roughly 2005 and later, China has implemented several welfare reform, including the healthcare reform, including pension reform, and all those things in hope that by distribution the resource more efficiently, that will help at least the poorest part of society. The good news is, yes, all those policies are in place. The bad news is a recent study worked with Wang Feng and other colleagues at Fudan, we show that China's redistribution process is also quite regressive. So this comes, I think the more fun, demography tend to change slowly. Demography is, I already said demographers like to say demography is destiny. It's set. It's not going to change quickly, but the room for change is through policy, and we have a huge, two main challenges. One is the social inequality. This is the question I think United States is facing the same question. China's, European countries are facing the same. When economy develop quickly and the inequality come out in full force, how the society will adapt to that. Secondly, China's GDP has been growing roughly 10% per year for the last 30-some years. Chinese government's revenue has been growing more than 15% per year. So even with that kind of growth, China is still running a deficit. Okay, so we cannot hope that Chinese government, this gap between government revenue growth and GDP growth will continue, and I don't know how to figure out this government capacity. Thank you very much.
So demography as destiny. I hope that you got those gigantic points that Professor Tsai was making. You'll have a chance to ask him questions after this next presentation. You'll get to hear from both him and Eric Fish talking about these things.